Okay, awesome. I'm going to get started. Hi guys, and welcome to the fourth and final webinar in this series on managing expectations of advanced therapies. Welcome. Just want to say I just want to start with a really quick thank you to our funders, and without who none of the trainings that we offer would be possible. So a big shout out to them. And I'm going to start with some housekeeping. So today's session is going to be run slightly differently to the previous webinars. As you've probably noticed, we're all in the same Zoom room because this is designed to be an interactive session. So we're going to start with a panel discussion with experts from across the rare and advanced therapy space before opening up to questions and discussion with you guys. So while the panel discussion is happening, if you could please mute yourself, but once we've got to the Q&A, if you do have a question, you can use the raise hand function that you can see at the bottom, or you can come off mute and just ask the question. And if you are having any technical difficulties, please just pop it in the chat, let us know, and we can get you sorted with that. Also, if you need subtitles, live transcription and subtitles can now be enabled in Zoom. You can turn them off and on through the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So just a little bit about Beacon. We are a UK-based rare disease charity with a vision of no rare journey alone and a mission of building a united rare disease community with patient groups at its heart. We all know the challenges rare condition faces in getting a diagnosis, accessing treatment, and the impact that living with or caring for someone with a rare condition can have on employment and on education. We exist to help relieve some of this burden. We support all patient groups, no matter their size or their aims, and we work to upskill them so that they are best able to support their community. And how do we do this? So our work comes in 3 different streams. We have patient group training, where we work to grow, form, and professionalize patient groups. And that's actually where the majority of our work goes. We also work within research, where we help patient groups find a place at the heart of research. We empower them to feel comfortable in this context and also to get their voices heard and needs listened to. And in addition, we work to build a rare community by facilitating connections and collaborations across the whole rare disease space. And as I mentioned, so this is the 4th webinar in our series, Understanding Genetics and Advanced Therapies. We had a session back in May on what are advanced therapies. We've looked at success stories and case studies, and we've also looked at market access and patient delivery in advanced therapies. These are all available on our resources hub if you didn't manage to catch the previous webinars, and I'll link to the resources hub at the end of the session. So hopefully you'll get a chance to catch up if you've missed out on those. So why did we decide to do a series on this topic? So we've been hearing a lot about advanced therapies. They seem to be in the news a lot at the moment, and especially in the rare community. But we wanted to put on this series specifically for patient groups. We wanted to be able to break down this topic in an accessible way so we can help you understand whether advanced therapies are a viable route to treatment for the condition that you represent. So from the previous sessions, we've learned that advanced therapies are incredibly complex scientifically. We've also learned that getting them approved and reimbursed comes with a lot of challenges and considerations. But this session is going to focus on managing expectations. So we're going to look at how to know if advanced therapies are the right route for your rare disorder. What's the current landscape like, and what to expect in the future, and what are the key considerations and next steps for patient groups looking to get involved in this space. And like I said, it is an interactive session. This is going to be a great opportunity for you to get your questions on this topic answered. We're going to have lots of time for questions after the panel, so that's good. Okay, and moving on to the panel, I'm happy to introduce our speakers for today. We've got a really great lineup of experts from across the field. We have Josie Godfrey from Realise Advocacy, Jess Courtney from the Haemophilia Society, Kate Hammond from Costello Medical, and Simon Waddington from UCL. And chairing the session will be Rick, CEO of Beacon. So I'm going to pass over to him now.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Hannah. Really glad to have you here today and hopefully have quite a good, in-depth, rich discussion all about gene therapies, advanced therapies, and yeah, the things and questions you guys need to know as patient organizations and how we begin to tackle this quite complex but fascinating area. So yeah, I'm not going to talk too much at the start because we've hopefully all been able to attend and look into the previous webinar series. What I will say, it's been really enjoyable to have some great talks over this period to learn a lot more about these therapies, and we hope that's given you a bit more insight into it. Today's your chance to ask the questions if you're unsure though. So firstly, please feel free to turn your cameras on to see your faces and engage with us as a panel. Will be fantastic. If you have questions at any point, feel free to use the raise hand, as Hannah mentioned earlier, to ask them. We've got a few questions you guys submitted beforehand as well. So we'll hopefully dive through those throughout the session. We're going to start with a little bit of an introduction to our panelists, and then I'm going to work on a couple of core questions we want to dive through at the beginning, hopefully get the juices flowing, the conversation started, and then trigger some good questions from you both in the audience. So to begin, it'd be great if the panelists here could introduce themselves. So the first one next to me appears to be Simon. So Simon, we'd love you to say hi and well, introduce yourself to the panel.
Hi there, thank you very much for having me along. I'm Simon Waddington. I'm Professor of Gene Therapy at University College London, and I've worked on developing gene therapies for childhood genetic diseases for about 20-25 years now.
Thank you very much, Simon. Lots of a rich experience we can dive into there. It should be interesting. Josie, you're up next.
Hi, thanks, Rick. Hi, everyone. So I'm Josie Godfrey. I've worn various hats. Rick and I always joke it's hard to know which one I'm wearing, so I'll try and point that out as we go. I have been working in rare diseases and advanced therapies, so cell and gene therapies, for about 14 years now. I did things like set up something called the Highly Specialized Technology Program at NICE. I've also worked in industry. I've been on the board of rare disease patient organizations. I've been a payer. I've worked, with NHS England and specialized commissioning. And I'm forgetting something, I know, but hope to be able to bring that broad experience to the discussion today. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Josie. Kate, lovely to see you.
Hi, yes, I'm Kate Hammond, and I'm Head of Rare Diseases and the Gene Therapy Lead at Costello Medical. So we are a consultancy and primarily work with pharmaceutical companies. We also do work with charities and not-for-profit businesses as well, like Beacon. And we essentially help to get new medicines to patients. So day-to-day, that means we work very closely with that clinical data, analysing it, and also building, the economic models that are needed by payers, such as NICE, to decide whether they're going to fund a treatment. The team I work within focuses on rare diseases, and with that, we've been working on a lot of gene therapy, so really specifically looking at the unique challenges to that rare disease gene therapy space. So, thinking about how should a new gene therapy be funded when we don't even know how long it's going to be effective for, when those trial populations are so small and it's hard to do those analyses. So that's a lot of the kind of day-to-day challenges we encounter and try and address.
Thank you so much, Kate. And last but by no means least, we have Jeff. Jeff, welcome.
Hi, I'm Jeff Corney. I do policy and public affairs at the Haemophilia Society. We're a small rare disease charity representing the 36,000 people with genetic bleeding disorders in the UK. Those are basically any condition that is genetic and that leads to people's blood not clotting properly. Most commonly, people have heard of haemophilia. The actual bleeding disorder in the UK is von Willebrand's disease, which may affect as many as 1 in 100 people, but also goes down to very, very rare bleeding disorders such as, say, factor 10 deficiency that affects less than 50. So I think there's quite a range of different bleeding disorders that are there. My role in policy and public affairs is representing the interests of patients to government, to parliamentarians, and to work with NHS England and NICE on new treatments. Currently, there are 2 licensed gene therapies for haemophilia, one of which is going through an HTA at the moment. So very much this is kind of very, very relevant to me. And yeah, and so I plan to bring the kind of patient perspective to today's conversations.
Brilliant, guys. Thank you very much. So hopefully you can all see we've tried to put a panel here together which has got rich levels of experience for you guys to ask questions to, but also that brings very different perspectives on this landscape to you all. So we want to make sure we can understand what the experience of patient groups is in actually trying to work through the process of bringing these these therapies to market. We want to understand that regulatory, that reimbursement perspective. We've got people who are actually at the coalface of academic science developing these drugs and thinking about how we actually move these therapies forward. And of course, that important interface with the companies that are actually producing them and the challenges they're facing to actually move these through to market. And we've heard already throughout this webinar series the many challenges, the many exciting opportunities that gene therapies bring. So given that we're trying to talk about managing expectations in the field of advanced therapies, we thought we'd start with a question to our panel as a whole that touches on those expectations. And I think the obvious thing that pops into my mind whenever you hear about these advanced therapies or gene therapies is that chance for you to have a curative therapy, a chance for something that's really going to make that huge impact on diseases that are otherwise unaddressed or very hard to address. And so I'd be really interested to get each of the panelists' thoughts on, if we're beginning at this stage in the life cycle of gene therapies and advanced therapies, to see some alignment between what the expectations were right when the field set out in your specific area and the reality we're seeing now in practice. So I don't know who of us would like to start with that interesting question on the alignment of expectations. Simon, yeah, please do. Thank you.
Sorry. I mean, I can certainly talk about the history of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, it was in the early 1990s when Ashanti De Silva was first treated with gene therapy. I think she was the first patient, and it showed some partial effect. But then what actually happened is that the hype machine took off. Everyone thought that gene therapy was solved, and so by the end of the decade, there was a huge amount of money going in, but there was an overinflated expectation. And then what actually happened is that a young man, Jesse Gelsinger, he died after gene therapy. And in gene therapy for X-linked severe combined immune deficiency, of the 15 kids that were treated, 5 of them actually went on to develop a leukemia. And so then the bottom fell out of the whole field. It became kind of a trough of disillusionment, as to quote the term. People then thought that gene therapy was finished. It was never going to work. It was going to cause cancer and immune reactions. But actually, those of us that were working in the field, we could see that this was going to work. And so what's actually happened is that slowly over the past 10 years, what has happened is that there has been a kind of a merging of the reality with the expectation, where now we know that gene therapy can treat some diseases effectively, but there's still a lot more work to be done. So I think we're now starting to see a coming together of these two things.
Thank you, Simon. That's great. Yeah, Josie, go on.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Simon. So yeah, I think that's right. It's coming together. I wouldn't say it's got together yet. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely still some differences. If I think about it from, say, the payer regulatory landscape, those first few gene therapies that were approved, Glybera, for example, they were undeniably commercial failures. You know, they didn't reach patients. They didn't have the impact that we might have hoped to see. They were unsuccessful from an industry perspective, and they weren't the sort of game changers that health systems were hoping to see. I think reality has sort of got a bit better now, so that there is that excitement and anticipation, at least in some disease areas, for some treatments, that this could really be a game changer. Haemophilia may well be one of those examples. But there's also a little bit of disillusionment, I suppose, with that science fiction that we saw back in the 90s. So there's been a lot of challenge about the long-term benefits of these treatments. Will we really see what it says on the tin happening? Will we really see the treatment being, if not something we would call a cure, effectively really transforming the lives and the course of the condition? And how long will that change last for? So that's starting to be pushed back, I think, now as we see more treatments and clinicians getting experience of using those, starting to be a bit more consensus about what one might expect in terms of the longevity of impact. The other area there for patients, I think, and Jeff might want to speak to this, is that there's a big gap between the promise of a cure and the reality of clinical trials and process. And it's, it's very challenging. I do a lot of work in the world space of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which has a number of gene therapy trials taking place at the moment. So unfortunately, there's been a lot of disappointments as well as a lot of promise, but it throws up a lot of questions for that community about what can we really expect? What patients are going to be targeted. In Duchenne, it's usually the boys who are still walking, and so older patients can be left behind, which is a really important consideration for patient communities, is how many patients will be affected by this treatment, and how do you stop those other patients being left behind and left out. And then choosing between trials, between treatments, knowing that if you take one, you may never be able to access another. So there's a lot, as Simon says, more work to be done, but I think slowly those questions of reality and the complexities of it are being addressed, rather than just either it's all or nothing, which we perhaps saw back in the 90s and so on.
Thank you, Josie. And before I come to Kate and Jeff, there's just something I want to pick up on there. Josie, you mentioned the promise of science fiction, I think, within the field of gene therapies. And Simon, obviously, in your first presentation you gave at the start of this webinar series, you really dealt with that kind of science fiction opinion that we see in films around gene therapies. And I just thought it's quite interesting that you had those examples prepared. And I wondered how you, as someone in the academic space that's been working in gene therapies for as long as you have, has had to deal with that kind of science fiction aspect of it. Has it been quite frustrating for you, and have you had to learn to handle that quite different perception of the science that you're working with?
I think, to be honest, the difficulty that we really had was the fact that in the 2000s, people, fairly senior people, so even the Genetic Alliance actually said, we don't think gene therapy is going to work. So in fact, we've kind of, there's been quite a headwind actually on this. So this has been quite difficult, but also now what we are finding difficult is that gene therapy for rare disease doesn't appear to be commercially very attractive. And so therefore we're developing these technologies. We're taking them to the point of where we want to do a clinical trial, but then we can't attract the funding to be able to take it to the next step, because it just doesn't make a lot of money for companies. So this is a sort of real problem for us now. That's our main problem I want to consider now, actually.
Thank you, Simon. That's really helpful, and probably gives us a little gateway into Kate's thoughts on this expectation versus reality piece within the realm that you're working, Kate.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I agree with what Josie was saying about, I think gene therapies were given this sweeping statement that they're all going to be, game changers, and what we now know and what we're seeing is that they're very different. Some will, and thinking like Zolgensma, are going to be very clinically effective and transformative therapies, and some won't. And then that leads me on to pricing, and that we hear a lot about the price of these therapies, and they are extraordinarily expensive. In a lot of cases, we're talking, the £1 million price tags that come with them. But what we also now know is that not every gene therapy will be or should be priced that highly, because they won't be as effective. And I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but you can't have in like the country like the UK, where we have an annual healthcare budget, all medicines that are gene therapies priced that highly. There's just not enough budget for them. So yeah, I think for me that's the biggest thing, is that they're very different, and some will be more clinically effective than others, some will last longer, have a longer duration of effect than others, and then the prices will be very different, and that's probably going to be the reality of what we see happening over the next few years. And yeah, I think that's kind of my key thoughts on that.
Thank you, Kate. That's fantastic. And Jeff, it kind of comes into you there, really. And as a group that have seen gene therapies actually reach market, that you have a kind of unique take, I suppose, on what the expectations were beforehand and what the reality is. It's really interesting to see how you view this alignment question.
Yeah, I think this is very difficult, because the amount of information we have about gene therapies has changed over time. And actually, haemophilia was a condition that was part of those early gene therapy trials in the 90s. And so there are people that have had gene therapy for 15, 20 years now. And and kind of, I think the community has seen time and time again, a cure for haemophilia is on the horizon. The BBC will run that as a headline when a new trial reports results. But actually, the reality for patients is a lot more complex than that. So I think firstly, from the 90s through to today, kind of the quality of care in haemophilia in general has got way better. In the 90s, people were being treated with plasma-derived blood products that had to be refined from blood donations. You had to inject them into yourself, daily or every other day. To nowadays, where treatment can be far less frequent. You get far better protection from bleeds. There are people with haemophilia that are taking part in high-level sports, that are running Ironman triathlons. So I think the change has happened a lot. And so kind of what it means to be a cure has changed over that time period. And so I think kind of where we are now, we have actually pretty good standards of care in haemophilia A and haemophilia B. And so for something to be a cure or be curative, you're really expecting it to be able to kind of replace that need for any other treatment and allow you to actually really do more, to almost forget you have haemophilia entirely. And so kind of therefore what the reality of the recent trials have been is that there's a fair amount of variation in the results that people get on the trials. In haemophilia A in particular, we've seen kind of levels dropping off over time. So it's not a cure forever. It's a cure maybe for 3 years or 5 years. The results we have suggest in B that it will last for a decade or more, but that's sort of uncertain in fact. And there's a fair amount of variation in just between results. So some people get very good outcomes and some people won't. And so there's a really difficult decision that patients have to make, saying, well, actually, is this treatment better than my other options? And or do I, even if gene therapy is right for me, do I wait and have the first generation of ones being licensed now, or do I wait another 5 years and see whether we have more data or other ones are licensed? So I think that kind of the gap around, or the challenge around patient expectations is that, yes, things improve over time, but really the kind of the challenge is actually the right decision will be very different for different people. And so I don't see in haemophilia in particular, with that care landscape, that gene therapy becomes the standard of care. Well, so my hope is that it becomes an option, and so there'll be some people who go, I'm at the stage in my life where actually I really, this is the right thing for me. I really, because there are a lot of benefits from it. Say, for example, like massively reduced burden of treatment. And that kind of, and so there'll be people that go, actually, that's the most important thing, so I'm going to replace it with there. So therefore, and that makes it, I guess, very difficult for us, the patient group, to represent it to NICE and to payers, to say, well, yes, we're saying this is better than the current standard of care, but for this group of people and in this circumstance. So yeah, I think it really is difficult to kind of talk about these things that can potentially be curative. But what that means for people will mean a lot of very different things, and whether it's right will vary a lot.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think all of you kind of touched on this idea that, again, it's going to vary so much between treatments, between patient groups, that just like any treatment or any situation in the world of rare diseases, the individual circumstances are going to really matter about how things are perceived and dealt with and move forward, which is an important point to layer on to what is often quite simplistic message that we have in our heads when we hear about these advanced therapies. They still come with all the complexities and unique challenges you expect in any other therapy, which I think is crucial. Just on that point, Jeff, as well, around managing expectations within the community, for a patient organisation in the position you're in, it's quite crucial to be able to communicate effective information and meaningful information about treatments that are in development and expectations. So I just wondered if you had any kind of quick thoughts to add about the role you have had to play so far and are still playing around, patient expectation management and effective communication in this advanced therapy space.
Yes, I think that's a real challenge that we've tried to grasp. How do we talk to our members about these new treatments, and particularly in the UK, where you get very little information from the companies themselves going to patients. The way we've tried to present it is, rather than trying to give kind of one correct answer, which there isn't, we've tried to set up almost panels of people. So you have someone who had gene therapy and it was a great success and it worked really well, and then we'll set them alongside someone who who had gene therapy, but actually is probably going to need to go back onto another treatment at some point in the next few years. And then you combine that with someone else who's managed their condition well with alternative options, and the three can sort of say, well, actually, there's three right answers. Here they are. And that then helps people to genuinely understand what those what those differences, because yeah, we've I think traditionally, when we've talked about haemophilia, it's like, here's your understanding haemophilia booklet, and it says, this is what the condition is, this is how it's managed, and this is what you shouldn't do. And it basically says, take your treatment and avoid playing rugby or boxing, and alongside some other complex things. Whereas now we actually say, no, you've got to consider these 3 different routes that you might go. And you're going to shift between them. So you might manage your condition in one way as a teenager, and then gene therapy and haemophilia is generally only available to adults. You might then choose to switch later on. And so therefore the way we talk to our members about it is by trying to just show that there are just alternative views or alternative approaches, and demonstrate that through examples of people who've chosen those different routes.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. And I think we'll keep coming back to this question around the communication engagement with patients from everyone's perspective, actually, in this field, because it's going to be really relevant, I'm assuming, to our audience today, and something we really want to tackle in the session. I'll quickly note here, guys, all of you guys in the audience, we're really keen to get questions and thoughts from you. I can see a bit happening in the chat already, but if at any point you have a question or a query for our panel here, please do raise your hands, put a question in the chat, because we'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. In the meantime, I'm going to go to my second kind of pre-question, which really kind of feeds on and follows on from what we've been talking about. Obviously, managing the expectations, getting their alignment right in the space is crucial. That kind of then leads to what we can expect to see in the future, and what is the long-term outlook. What are the next 5 years going to look like? What are the next 10 years going to look like in the space of advanced therapies? And I'd be really interested to see what everyone's thoughts are on the long-term sustainability of gene therapies and other advanced therapies within our health system, whether that's the UK health system or more broadly. What do you see as the place this is going to go? How common is it going to be? What disease areas is it going to spread into? And what are those big challenges that are going to need to be addressed quickly? So I don't know who'd like to start with this and wade into it. I'll pick someone if needs be.
I'm happy to have a start and bring some different perspectives. I mean, I think it's a real challenge, right? And there's definitely remains a big gap between, shall we say, research, manufacturing, industry expectations about reimbursement, about routes to access, about saturation in terms of what the uptake will be, that are maybe not matched by the reality that they will find. So we've, any of us working in this space or interested in these kinds of issues will see the newspaper headlines about world's most expensive drug, which seems to come through thick and fast. There used to be years between each new most expensive drug, and now it seems to be every couple of months there's a new world's most expensive drug, and they are these days inevitably gene therapies. Now that really scares a lot of people, right? Because it's a lot of money we're talking about. That doesn't mean it's not a lot of value, doesn't mean it's not a lot of benefit, but those big headlines are really scary. If you're the one trying to find the money, as Kate alluded to, if you're the one managing the budgets, there's a big scary numbers, and you need to know what you're getting for, and there will be a limit. There will be a limit. We don't necessarily know what that is yet, and it may vary depending on how effective that treatment is, how many people are going to receive it. Yeah. So your budget impact and your clinical effectiveness will impact on what that price is. At the moment, I work with a lot of companies who think that they could just sort of look at what the last guy's got and charge the same thing. And I can see Kate nodding. It's not how it works. You say it's not how it works. I also talk to a lot of companies, really amazing science-led, research-led companies who don't get that there's anything after getting a license. They don't understand that there are going to be the details, there are more barriers that are going to face. And so preparing for that can be left to the last minute. And that's preparing for that access, that reimbursement by companies, but also by patient groups and others and clinicians who maybe come quite late to thinking about what is it going to require for my patient community to actually be able to access this treatment if it's successful in the trials. And there's a lot that can be done to help that, which will start to speak to the sustainability of these treatments. Earlier you engage and the earlier you think about it, the better. And the more realistic companies and others are about what's the reimbursement landscape going to look like by the time I get there, because it's changing all the time. Expectations are changing all the time. And just because one company gets the world's most expensive drug doesn't mean the next one will. So there's a lot there that can be done individually to address some of those sustainability issues. But collectively, we are going to see a shift, particularly, and Simon might be able to speak to this, but there's a lot more research happening, it seems, at the moment in more common conditions, in conditions such as Alzheimer's, in conditions such as cardiac health. So we're not going to see the same pricing expectations and the same kind of engagement and rollout of these treatments as we would see when we had, say, Strimvalis, which was an ultra rare disease. So there's going to have to be system-wide discussions about, where do we target this? How do we rightfully and appropriately value the benefit that's coming, but don't keep this same high blanket expectation that next month there'll be another world's most expensive drug.
Thank you, Josie. There's lots to touch on there, and I do think the regulation and reimbursement end of the spectrum is an area where there's still a long way to go and lots of work to be done to actually work out how to build something sustainable there. And I think we need to probably come back on a bit more detail on that in a little while, again, depending on what the questions in the room are. I think I might just lead into Kate at this point, because it feels logical that you might be able to kind of follow on some of the thoughts Josie's had there and the industry perspective on this, because they're going to see, I guess, the challenges of that regulatory reimbursement space, but also will have a perspective on where things are going in the pipeline. And if we are really seeing this growth and boom, and if this is the way the industry is actually moving in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think there's going to be lots more of these therapies in the next 5 years, as Josie said, in common diseases, which raises all kind of questions about how they're going to be priced. I think there's also going to be a lot of positives. So we know there are big safety concerns around gene therapies. They still exist. Gene therapies and the cell therapies are made in different ways. They use different vectors, which come with different safety concerns. And I think a positive is that the more of them, the more we learn and the more they can be refined and made safer. So I think that's going to be something good that will speed up the development of these therapies. We know that, for example, when patients, if they pass away during a trial, which is the most serious adverse event you can happen, the trial has to stop, rightly so. And, we can get over those safety concerns, that will massively help as well. And I think on the pricing point, these therapies can't sit on shelves. We can't make them see they're effective and not get them to patients. So there is going to have to be, getting to a point where as more of them come, find, I don't know if alternative is the right word, and it will be so different in every country, but ways in which we can pay for these therapies. And that will be probably compromised between manufacturers, lots of discussions between them, the payers involved. And also that's where the patient groups come in and really kind of explain the value that those therapies will bring. And this is what Jeff was touching on, where it's the only therapy in a disease area, that value is very different to a disease area where there are choices and where the gene therapy might not be as a game changer or a transformative therapy. And that's, the patient groups will play a massive role in informing kind of those discussions, which helps the manufacturer know how they should be thinking about these therapies, and that they're not necessarily should be, 1 million, 2 million pound therapies. Because as Josie said, sometimes that is the perception, and that is the wrong perception to have. And they need to also be realistic, and we're all on this learning curve as well. And I just wanted to touch on, going back to what I think Simon was saying earlier, and if I remember correctly, Simon, about there are these therapies, but there's kind of not the commercial uptake to get them into trials. I'm definitely speculating here, but I wonder, hopefully in the next few years we'll see a shift that there is more as we get over these safety concerns. As they're not seen as so risky, as these pricing negotiations don't necessarily last years and years and require lots of time and investment as they get easier. Then maybe they'll seen as less risk, and they'll get into trials, which is obviously what we need to happen, and not have that delay.
Thanks, Kate. That's a nice point to bring in. I was going to bring in Simon next anyway. So Simon, I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on Kate's point there, and there's about 6 different topics I can unpack with you here. So I'll let your general thoughts go first.
Yeah. So what we certainly in terms of the cost of manufacture. So I mean, this is something that perhaps Jeff will appreciate. So, you know, back in the mid 2000s, I was given some vector to test in some haemophiliac mice by Amit Nathwani, and so I became friends with someone called Adam Jones, who has haemophilia B, and I said to him at the time, I said, there's probably enough vector in this vial to treat you of your haemophilia, and that vial probably cost, I don't know, at the time it probably cost about £10,000 to make. Now we can make that amount of vector for about £2,000. But if you want to make that vector to treat a person, the total cost is, you know, the total cost is coming in at, you know, hundreds of thousands of pounds. Because what's happened in across the world and the country is that the world just does not have enough capacity to be making the vectors for the number of clinical trials that are coming online. Also, gene therapy, I compare it to essentially brewing beer or making wine, in that it's a pretty complex substance, and we're still trying to work out how to do quality control on this to make sure that everyone gets the same stuff all the time. These are things that are I'm sure are going to change over the next few years, but we still have got a lot of work ahead of us on this.
Thanks, Simon. That's really interesting, really helpful. There's something that struck me earlier in the conversation. You're probably the most optimistic of the panel with regard to the alignment between expectation and reality, which I think to me makes sense because you're earlier in the pathway, you've been doing the science so long, and the scientific perspective is now more aligned with what is achievable. But we're also now seeing this staggered effect you talked about, where actually what's happening right at the far end, the regulation, the approval, the reimbursement, is going to stymie some of the research getting to that clinical stage this as well, which is quite challenging. Is there a place, and do you think there could be a place in the next few years for groups like yourself, academics for yourself, beginning to try and push forward gene therapy trials in some of these rare disease areas independent of that industry route? And if the funding is available, is that something that can be explored, or is it too challenging a type of trial to deliver for that academic pathway?
It's exactly what the sort of thing that we're looking at. You know, so and it's a problem that we're bashing his heads up against, because, you know, we're developing gene therapies for ultra rare childhood Parkinson's disease, for example. And we're realizing that it's going to be a previous experience has taught us that it's going to be tough to raise the money for this. So we are looking at, for example, you know, attracting funding from LifeArc, for example, to be able to take this through. I mean, what's happening is that the paths are being formed now ahead of us, for example, at Great Ormond Street. So the surgeons become familiar with the sort of technologies. The whole process, we've become more familiar with the regulators. The regulators becoming more familiar with the technologies. So you've kind of we're now starting to slipstream to be able to do this faster and easier. But it's almost certainly for some of these ultra rare diseases, it's going to have to be through an academic environment, I think. So yeah, I would agree on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. That's really helpful. Russell, thanks. Really good to see your hand raised. Is this a new question or something on the topic? If it's on the topic, I'll take it now. If not, I'll let Jeff respond to this and then come to you.
I'm quite happy for you to keep the flow going with Jeff, and I'll speak. It's on the same topic, but let's hear Jeff first, by all means.
Thank you, Russell. Appreciate it. Just wanted to check with you. Yeah, Jeff. So your perspective on this, and I think, you know, where do you think things are going in this field, and from the patient perspective, where do they need to get to make this a much smoother process?
Yeah, actually, I was sort of thinking slightly about kind of like where things are going, and I was going to think a little bit from the patient perspective. I think sometimes we talk about sort of ATMPs as if there's this revolution that's going to come, and suddenly it's going to kind of hit the NHS, and there's going to be everyone's going to be having ATMPs, and I think that's we always talk about things quite broadly, but actually I don't think that's really the case at all. I think we're going to see them in individual disease areas, and you're going to see them come in and change that disease area, and in, so haemophilia, where we've talked about it, there's an existing patient pathway that goes from children being diagnosed through to old age, and it slots in there somehow. In other disease areas where you don't have people living, say, beyond their teens or living into adulthood, it will change your patient pathway. It will change where you have to receive care, but it will mainly change it for that condition and people living with that condition. I think we're quite a long way away from the idea that you're going into a hospital, and you're getting kind of screened for a whole bunch of diseases, and basically there's a whole bunch of ATMPs that they say, well, this is the right one for you. I think we're decades away from that, if that ever happens at all. So I think kind of almost that's kind of my sort of to sort of add kind of from the patient perspective. I think it's very important to sort of manage expectations, but also just kind of think about, it will vary massively from disease area to disease area, the impact this will have, and the impact will be very different in each of those spaces. So kind of to the kind of people sort of listening from patient groups, I think it's understanding kind of what is feasible in your area that you work in. Are there things that are within 5 years of licensing, or is this a far longer process or different process that you need to go through instead?
Thanks, Jeff. That's a great point. I think something we want to come back to again, talking about which these areas might be able to see some action and activity in this space in the medium term, because really that's what you're talking about from early development, and which this is really long term for, and appreciate you bringing that up so clearly and voicing that. So again, guys in the audience, love to get your thoughts and opinions on this. Where do you guys see your disease areas slotting in the gene therapy space? So if you have any thoughts or comments on that, please do contribute. Before we come to Russell's question at this stage, we just thought we'd do a quick poll of people in the audience. We're interested just to get a sense of what your current experience is in this space, to help us gauge a little bit more of the answers we're giving, to make sure we're not getting too far down the pathway, and we can tailor somewhat of our answers to you. So Hannah, if you'd be able to just launch the poll briefly, and guys, if you can just fill in an idea, I think it's any and all of these that apply. What is your current level of involvement? Are you simply here to learn, or have you got a therapy out there already, or anything in between? So I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer that, and I will keep saying words to fill in space and stop us getting auditorily bored. Thank you. All right, we're seeing a few answers coming through now, which is great. Lots of news and learning, as we'd expect, but we have actually got a few people in the room who've got some experience and within this. How are we doing? 10 out of 16 participated. That may in fact be the panel that haven't. So that will probably do. I will end that now and just quickly share this so everyone can see. So at least 5 people in the room are completely new to advanced therapies and here to learn. So welcome, guys. Please do share any questions you've got and things that are really pertinent to you at the start of this journey. We'd love to hear that. One group with something that's being developed, which is interesting, and then a few others of you with kind of staggered experience in the therapy itself. So 2 that have an advanced therapy available, 2 that are currently supporting regulation. We'd love to hear about your experiences there, guys, and the challenges you're facing, and others that are involved. 4 of you are involved in supporting research and development. So really interesting spread, actually, and not so far from probably what I would have predicted at the start of this. So thank you for that. I'll stop sharing that. And Russell, we'd love to bring you into the conversation now. What's your question and comment?
Well, first of all, my apologies. I missed the first sort of 25 minutes because I was in another meeting, unfortunately. So I'm going to have to wait for the recording to see what I've missed, which puts me at something of a disadvantage. But I don't think I'm going to be addressing things that have already been resolved. I think there's an astonishing degree of naivety, frankly, about the whole area of gene therapy. I don't know if you're aware, but The Economist last week ran a piece focused mainly on the US, on the affordability of gene therapies, and with a pretty bleak outlook at the moment. As they've commented, and as so many people have commented before, we're all waiting for the price of gene therapies, the cost of them, to tumble. But I've seen this forecast and people discussing this now for about 4 or 5 years, and we've not seen any slippage at all. I think some of that has been down to the pandemic. If it hasn't been mentioned already, that has caused, not only for so many other things, but for the progress of gene therapies, it's caused a huge amount of disruption, from which I think we're still recovering. I'm involved in my disease area. I represent patients with Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. We have a gene therapy for that condition that was developed several years ago. I actually took part in scientific advice meetings with EMA. 8 years ago was the first involvement on this as a part of the EMA team. Left EMA to spend time with the company as much as they would allow me to, which was not enough, to try and help them in the design of their study. They didn't listen enough, and the trials were flawed as a result, and they've really struggled. And then actually, just over a month ago, about 6 weeks ago, the company had a meeting with EMA, which I wasn't involved in, and they subsequently, the following day, withdrew their application. This was an application that was lodged in October 2020, so just at the beginning of the pandemic, suffered greatly from the pandemic, and it was subject to several clock stops. There's been a clock stop for several months now, and it was still not anticipated to be adjudicated on for another year yet. But after this last meeting, the company felt that EMA were so negative that they had no option other than to withdraw their application, and were about to enter into another scoping exercise, which has now just been suspended indefinitely, quite obviously, because there is nothing to scope for the moment. We as a patient community are now scrabbling around trying to see what we can do to repair the damage. And there is significant damage here. I think I'm still personally not 100% convinced that this therapy is effective enough to justify its high cost and its approval. But on the other hand, I am far from being convinced that the decision has based on sound data and on sound evidence. I think there has been far too much emotion, far too much noise created, and it would take me a long time to go into the specifics of it. But essentially, we have so many problems, so much confusion surrounding this topic, and not enough clarity of thought as to how we're going to resolve it. And we must resolve it. It must be fixed. We cannot take this therapeutic area and abandon it as being just too complicated or too expensive. I applaud, is it Simon, his comment that some of it has to come from academia and from clinical production sources. But we have this huge problem, and I'm not a scientist. It strikes me that there's an awful lot of IP involved that is standing in the way of reducing these costs. And this needs to be properly tackled, and probably tackled at a political level more than a scientific one, to reduce those barriers that are standing in the way of making these treatments affordable. Sorry, soapbox over.
Russell, thank you. It's a really detailed example and a case study of the situation you find yourselves in. It really highlights the huge challenge that is in place within the space of rare diseases in trying to push any kind of treatment across the line, but especially when you layer in the complexities that exist around some of these advanced therapies and the uncertainty that can exist in that regulatory space. I think you've highlighted that very clearly. And obviously something you did pull up, which I think we do want to talk about within the panel, is your attempts to provide meaningful information from the patient perspective on how this trial should be defined, designed, how the evidence should be generated that means you have the best chance to demonstrate true value and impact to patients. And I think that is something we will probably all pick up on shortly. I don't know if any of the panel have any quick comments from what Russell says, or if we'll go to Rick next. Then Josie may be keen, or all good. Yeah, Josie, very briefly.
Yeah, thank you for that. A lot in that statement, Russell, so I'm not even going to attempt to unpack everything you've said, but I did want to just pick up on what you said around the uncertainty in the data and the trial design, and not bringing patients in and not bringing that perspective in, because that's so important. And I think I mentioned earlier, we sometimes do see these incredibly science-driven small companies or institutions that maybe sometimes forget that science isn't enough actually to be successful through the regulatory, to be successful for access, and to be successful for uptake and patients actually using it. There's more that goes on, and there's more that's needed. And patient perspective is so important to understand what's important, to understand the real impact of the condition, to understand expectations and aspirations. There's nothing worse when you're sitting on that sort of decision maker side to see data that could have been great, but has just been handled badly and isn't able to tell the story. And you know that there's probably more benefit and more value in a treatment than you're able to tell from the data. And quite often, you're absolutely right, Russell, it is because patients have not been involved, and you can see that. Sometimes it's because nobody knew what it was going to do until they got started, right? I'm not suggesting it's always avoidable, but sometimes it is. It's focusing on things that are relatively easy to measure instead of what's really important to measure. And they're not always the same thing. So thinking through, sort of how patient organizations and advocates such as yourself are able to be heard in the drug development space and to have that influence is really important. There are things that can be done. There are also situations, where it can seem to fall on deaf ears. It's so important for all the patient groups on this call to think early about what can they bring to the table and what might be missing if they don't get to the table and do that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you, Josie. Maybe we'll just run with this theme a little while, if you don't mind holding on to your question for a short while, Rick. Jeff, I'd be interested just to see some of your thoughts on the importance of patient engagement developed there, and if you have any examples of the role that Haemophilia Society has played in the development and is playing in the development of some of these new therapies. I think it'd be really nice to feature them, and then probably following that we might bring Kate in and some of her perspectives on how industry is trying to improve the way it's engaging patients effectively. So Jeff, I'll pass to you.
Yes, yeah, I think it's obviously clear to everyone that involving patients as early on as possible in the process can only really bring benefits, because you're adding an extra perspective to it, and it's quite interesting. So in my experience, that there are some companies that are very good at doing that, and we've had companies come to us before they've even at preclinical stage to say, we'd like to discuss with you something we're considering doing a phase 1 trial. What are your thoughts on it? And when we've had
Give it a second.
Realize that you're the patient group. Do you want to come in and have a chat?
Oh, you're all right, Jeff. Now you've come back in. That's absolutely fine. Please continue.
Sorry, did you lose me there?
Just a little robotic freeze, but I think we got all the words through, so that's okay. No, he's gone again. Sorry, guys. The internet always messes up when you least want it to.
I can just about still hear you.
Yeah, so just then you were, you're moving again, Jeff. Do you want to try and continue from there? Because I think we've only lost a couple of words, if anything. So please carry on, and if it freezes again, we'll give it a pause.
Okay, let's see. Is that back again?
Yeah, you're good.
So depending on where I got to, I was talking about kind of the wide variation in when companies come to us.
Yes.
And yeah, I think in general, kind of the extreme end is that there was at least one company recently came to us post-license to say, we have a product that's just been licensed in your area, let's have some conversations about it. And I think obviously we need to make a case for why it's important for them to talk to us early. And I think the most important part of that is around kind of what outcomes and things they're measuring. So trials in these rare diseases tend to be single-arm trials. You're not directly comparing them to something else. You might have like a feed-in period of some sort, and we might be comparing it to the current standard of care, but ultimately you've got one arm of people there that are having the treatment. And so what we've been able to say to them is to say, don't just look at previous treatments and measure the same stuff, but actually come to us to talk about what's most relevant now. How far have things moved on? And the example here is that traditionally in haemophilia, they've measured annual bleed rate, which is basically how often do you have either a traumatic or a spontaneous bleed. It's kind of this a painful event where you end up with a lot of blood, often inside joints or in muscles. But actually, with the standard of care getting to the stage where people on good managed conditions are having 0, 1, or 2 a year, it's very hard to show an improvement on existing standards of care using that traditional measure of annual bleed rate. So we're saying, well, actually, you need to look at pain, you need to look at kind of the burden of treatment, you need to look at mental health outcomes, you need to look at kind of worry, anxiety, ability to take part in work, ability to take part in sport, and other things. There's a whole range of other things that you need to be measuring. And so I think, almost to us this is kind of obvious and simple, but there are companies that go, oh, actually, yeah, we just read through some of the literature and people are always measuring the stuff, and we're going, yeah, but that's not going to get you across the line anymore. And I suspect in other disease areas there'll be similar stories where just the situation has moved on, or just have a better knowledge as the patient group of what the key issues are now, and can help companies to make sure they build that into their trials.
Thanks, Jeff. That's bang on, and really just highlights that the importance of those simple conversations can get very simple answers that people just wouldn't otherwise think of in this space, and that's very simple value that patient engagement can bring to these projects. I mean, Kate, obviously you've been working with lots of different groups that are trying to develop drugs in this space. What are you seeing in their attempts to do patient engagement? What's growing, what's developing, and does it make a big impact on decisions?
Yeah, firstly, I would say it's really different. Like, I think you'd be surprised. There are some companies, I think as we touched on, that are good at doing this. They have literal people in job roles, departments that their job is to engage with patient groups and work with them very closely. There are some companies, and I'm thinking as well about some really small biotechs or pharma, and they've never done this before. A lot of them have started out as maybe academics in the lab, and they're trying to commercialize. Understandably, they don't know how you do this, when you do this, and I don't think there's probably enough out there to support some of these companies about how to best engage and when that engagement is helpful, and there's probably more we can do to facilitate that. So yeah, there's a really big spectrum of people knowing how and when to engage, and maybe some of the payer organizations as well, and companies like us, we have a guide now on how patient groups, how pharma should be engaging with patient groups at which stage of the HTA process as well, to facilitate that. And then the other thing I was going to say was just thinking about what Russell was saying, and obviously I don't know the specifics of that situation. It sounds extremely difficult, is a feedback cycle. So we know sometimes like pharma companies will have an advisory board and bring patient group experts or patient experts in and ask them questions and take that. And then that's it. That's it. They go away and they do what they want to with that information. But, there needs to be that feedback sequence, where pharma go back and go, okay, this is what we've done with that. This is how we've used this information, or this is how we haven't. And then it gives them the patient experts a chance to go, oh, okay, but we want to question you on this, or why not this? And it helps build that relationship and that collaboration. And I don't think that happens enough. And I think pharma really, can and should, and patient groups can as well question more. And I think that needs to happen more, really. And I probably don't see that enough. And I think that will hopefully make a difference as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. It's a really good point. And a lot of the work we do when thinking about collaborations between industry and patient groups, the word we keep coming back to is trust, and finding ways to build that trust. And simply having that kind of feedback cycle in place means that you are asking questions and then showing how actually you're implementing the change based on that. And too often it doesn't happen, and that leaves patient groups and people who are consulted feeling that it was tokenistic, and that's a huge problem. And whether that's in this space or others, I think it's a really important thing to pull out. Josie, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, just building really on what Kate said, I think it's a bit of a mind shift, isn't it? Because there are lots of companies, myself included, who can help people do this, and Kate and others on the call, but it's not actually rocket science. It's not actually, when you come down to it, I shouldn't say this out loud, I'll never make any money, but it's really not that difficult. It's about thinking we're doing things with people instead of to them. It's really that simple. The thing, how we want to work in this area, we need to work with the stakeholders in this area to make sure we're bringing our part of that, of what's needed, not just doing something to them and hoping they'll be so grateful that they'll tell us everything we need and we can tick the boxes. It's really just about engaging with people and partnering, not patronizing, I suppose it's the word. Sorry, a little soapbox on my own.
And it's always needed and appreciated. I'm going to come briefly to you, Sam, because I think it's an interesting angle on this. Where does patient engagement sit within the space of academic research and development of treatment? Because I think in some cases it's quite hard to think how that works. In other cases, I know there's an increasing drive within the world of academia to be ensuring that you can effectively, clearly communicate with patients and the public about the work that you're doing. So yeah. I wondered where your perspective is on this, and if you're seeing a change in that and how it can benefit your work.
So I guess that I was quite lucky, because when I was developing gene therapies for haemophilia back in the early 2000s, I worked very closely with Catherine Domley Trust, and also actually is with the Haemophilia Society. And so not only was I able to actually have good conversations and become friends with people with haemophilia, but also is that I started to learn about the disease, the diseases, and started to understand how our therapies and how our models did or did not actually reflect the condition of patients as well. But also is that I was then also given the opportunity to be able to speak to patient organizations and communicate the science and exactly where we were. And so in 2008 I spoke at the Haemophilia Society, and they ran a poll on how many people would consider gene therapy. So I mean, it's been a really important part of our activities and career. So therefore, just as an example, so my colleague and mentee works on Dravet syndrome, and yes. So therefore you have mice that have epilepsy, Dravet syndrome, and one thing that she's learned from this actually is that the important readout is actually the number of seizures that mice get, because this is the thing that matters to me with Dravet syndrome. So this sort of feedback really early on informs the sort of analyses we do, because then when we are looking at these readouts in mice, we then will go to the regulators and say that we're taking things here that are clinically relevant outcomes, which actually then smooths the entire path. So really early engagement, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Simon. That's brilliant to hear, actually. And I just wondered, do you feel that experience you're talking about is something that's growing, is more common in the space now? Is your experience different to your colleagues, or do you think broadly across the people you're working with, you're seeing a lot of that in academic engagement with those groups?
I don't know, because I mean, I work really closely with people like Paul Gizon and Manju Kurian and other Shamima Rahman at Great Ormond Street Hospital. So therefore we have this very close relationship with treaters that have very close relationships with the families. So I have a rather shuttered view, as it were, of how people in the broader community see things. I'm not really sure, but I mean, I think that at least in this country, so the British Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, one of their main founding remits was to try to communicate the science and progress of gene therapy. So they have public engagement days every year, this sort of stuff, and they have now a committee for that purpose. So I think particularly for gene therapy, there's always been an awareness that there needs to be kind of this bilateral relationship, I think.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Simon. Hard questions, but I'm personally quite interested in it. It's really great to hear that perspective. So thank you. Rick, you've waited very, very patiently. So it'd be a pleasure to come to you now and hear your thoughts.
Hi, Rick, thanks. And just, it was good to listen whilst I was waiting, actually, because I really agree with a lot of the comments that were made, particularly the sort of dominance of biomarkers as being that's what all the clinical trials are set up with, and not looking at some of the things that Jeff mentioned, like pain and caregiver quality of life as another one I was thinking of. But the point I was going to make is I just wanted to know about the panel's view on, which you've sort of touched on, is sort of cliff edge that I think is being created by trying to get through clinical trials. So, for example, in the States last year, one of the CEOs of the company that was, I think it was Duchenne, it might have been Sarepta, trying to put through, get their drug through approval. And he's basically saying that, there's the risk of the FDA, and I suppose the equivalent in Europe and the UK, just shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that, as I think you were mentioning earlier on, drugs that only offer a sort of modest improvement, why can't we let them be a kind of bridge to better ones? So, for example, there are some drugs that were approved, way back in sort of 2016, and they're saying that actually the approval of those early drugs and getting sales from those early drugs enables the payment, or at least the investment, into research into things like gene therapy. And so, which is incredibly expensive, as we know. And there's this massive cliff edge, but potentially, I think, between either it achieves an amazing result up front, and the first therapy treatment is unlikely to be the best. So either you don't go for trial until you've had 3 or 4 iterations, which delays it even longer, or you try to get something which has some benefit, but it gets knocked down for not having enough versus the standard of care. So the costs start to escalate, and it gets harder and harder to get it through. And so I kind of see this sort of cliff edge where, the bar is getting so high that I don't know how that's going to really work for the current patients. So I just thought with some of the people in the room, and Josie sort of touched on this, I think, earlier on, and just wondered if there's any comments on that.
Thank you, Rick. Josie, I see you on mute straight away. So
I'll kick off. It's interesting you're talking about that from a regulatory perspective, because I think a lot of the time, we hear, Kate probably hears this as well, slightly more positive perspective on regulators like FDA, EMA, MHRA, than on the then getting it paid for parts of the equation. And I think that's sort of a mixed truth of that. It can be really difficult, but where that works happens, that sort of early engagement, that evidence, you can see a willingness from regulators to want to approve treatments, particularly where there's nothing else out there. That's not always the case, and there are still standards to share, and I didn't want to dwell too much on it. Do a lot of work in that area. There's a lot of companies working in that space, and there's been a lot of regulatory challenges getting things over that line. And it is certainly possible that some of that is to do with the way things are measured, the nature of the condition, the relatively slow progression of the disease. So there's a lot that goes into trying to measure even a small impact, let alone measure a big impact and think about the durability of effect. So without going into any specifics, hopefully that sort of touches on the regulatory side. The bigger challenge is probably that if you get these things approved with a very small benefit, potentially, or a smaller than expected, smaller than hoped for benefit, then you come very quickly up against perhaps a higher bar of evidence, certainly in Europe and similar countries, around health technology assessment, where they're looking not just at whether or not there's a benefit, but how to quantify that benefit, how to capture that benefit and translate that into what seems to be a reasonable price, a reasonable approach to reimbursement. And that's a real challenge for those products that are maybe adding just a little bit to what might already be a challenging environment. And then really hoping for those step changes to get the reimbursement, to get the return on investment, so that they can put it into the next drug that might be even better. So it's really complicated. I think you're touching on something that's real and is important and is challenging. But the regulators are always going to put safety first. Sometimes that's really hard to understand, and to see some signs of benefit. We've seen things go through with conditional licenses, for example, really hard to then get reimbursement. So it needs to be taken as a whole picture, bringing those patients in, getting the data around the disease, getting the data around the potential benefits, and measuring the right things is a really important step towards getting approvals at each of those stages.
Thank you, Josie. Any else on the panel want to come in on that, or content with Josie's summary?
I just maybe want to add the kind of thought that I think, in my experience, sometimes I think that there are some of these treatments that have a sort of window of effectiveness, and I think it's probably like I can sort of retrospectively I can see them. I think knowing them at the time, but there's certainly ones I've seen within the bleeding disorder space where I know that if they'd basically been made available at the point of licensing, they would have been effective in the NHS for 2 or 3 years, by which time they would have been replaced by something better. But if that period, obviously from licensing to reimbursement is 2 or 3 years, then they're just never going to get reimbursed. And I guess the downside is twofold there. Firstly, it's on patients who could have benefited partially from something slightly earlier, but also I think what's coming across in this panel is obviously there's a loss to companies there that actually genuinely developed something that had value, but its value only had a certain moment at which it could have been, and so that kind of discourages that slow improvement, that slow innovation, if you can't kind of identify that benefit at the moment it exists. The innovative medicines fund, I guess, is supposed to sort of deal with aspects of that problem, but yeah.
Good question. Good point. Thank you. Russell, do you want to come on this?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is whenever we try and simplify anything, we end up not being able to articulate it that well. And this is a really thorny issue that I've spent a lot of time on. First of all, regulators, and I spend a lot of time with EMA, the European Medicines Agency, through various committees and involvements. In general, they want to say yes. You know, they really are the man from Del Monte. Their objective in life is to get things approved, but they will not do it by lowering their standards. Payers, by contrast, very often seem to want to say no and are looking for excuses to say no. And sometimes that is the case because they are charged with managing the budget on behalf of payers and health services. And we really have to come down to, number one, there are two big issues for me. Who is going to pay and how? And we already have a situation where health services are operating under seriously constrained budgets. They can't really afford the treatments we have now. And we're talking about replacing a lot of them with a raft of much, much more expensive treatments. So it's a scary thought. But then secondly, actually, even if we could, in this utopian world we would like to live in, disregard the cost, there is actually a risk when we keep getting these small incremental improvements that we actually make life harder for ourselves. And I've had a number of discussions with EMA, including in the last few weeks, over this particular failed application that I mentioned before, yes, where one of my biggest worries is that at the moment they will accept there is an unmet need in our particular disease area, even though there is actually a treatment already approved. If we get something approved that improves marginally on what we already have, that raises the bar for the next hurdle. And at some point, we will find that we will actually be putting off further research on new treatments because they have to use the existing treatment as a comparator. And so their hurdle will be that much higher. Now, that might seem cockeyed, but it is a real risk that the treatment we really want doesn't happen because we fought so hard for the treatment that gets us part the way there. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but there are dangers, and it's much more complex than we would like to think.
Thank you, Russell. Really interesting angle there. Josie, I see your hand go up. I'm sure you want to come in on the
Sorry, I couldn't not respond to the idea that payers want to say no. I think that it's certainly not why I went into my career in healthcare, to say no to a lot of people. And I've really yet to meet anyone in that environment who wants to say no. I think, however, what they do want to do is and need to do is use the resources they have in whichever healthcare system, whichever situation they're finding themselves in, to treat a wider population. And sometimes that makes for really difficult decisions. But I usually say, you know, you go to NICE, they want to find a way to say yes, especially when there's high unmet need. Nobody wants to say no, but they do have to follow certain rules. We can try and change the rules, but there will always be some kind of rules and criteria for those decisions. That's a whole separate conversation, and Rick knows that we could do a whole other series on that if we wanted, but it's really important to understand nobody is in this system to try to block your access to effective new treatments. Nobody wants that. Everybody wants to find a better outcome. It's just that everyone's working under other drivers and other factors that sometimes mean we're all speaking different languages and we can't find alignment as readily as we would want. But I do think it's important to remember there's human beings at the end of each of those processes. And actually there are ways you can connect and help make that easier. Sorry, thank you.
That's cool. I mean, that just brings us a little bit briefly onto this concept of value, which we talked about earlier, and what the value is in gene therapies and advanced therapies, and how that compares to some other treatments. I just wondered if Josie, Kate, and any of you actually have any thoughts on the value that is, the potential value that is in this space, and how that should be translated into the price.
Happy to kick off, and let others follow. But I think it's really important, as someone who's been a payer, or been a health technology assessment person, I have never knowingly cared about the mechanism of action of a new treatment. I really don't care. I care what it does. I don't care why it does what it does. That's Simon's bag, that's the science, it's super important. But I'm never going to be a scientist, I'm never going to be a clinician. I just want to know what's the problem and what's it achieving. And so the fact we talk about gene therapies, yes, they do often face certain sets of challenges, but not all of those are because they're gene therapies. Enzyme replacement therapies, other products for ultra-rare treatments will face a lot of the same challenges. So what I would want to know in valuing any treatment is going to be, what's the improvement? What's the impact in as broad a way as possible on patients? What's the impact on the health system? Yeah, so am I releasing clinical time? Am I keeping people out of hospital? Or am I having to create a whole new structure and service? I want to understand that impact. I want to know what it costs, what it really costs in terms of what's cost of display. So what's it saving me, but also what's new. And I want to understand how long those will be. So if you think NICE in the UK, they tend to work on a lifetime perspective. So they want to know what's changing across a whole patient's expected lifetime in terms of the benefits and in terms of the costs. And it's really, really hard to do that with any degree of accuracy. But it's really important that they want to take that perspective, even when it's not a gene therapy, even when it's just a symptomatic relief. That is the starting point, is to assume we're looking across a lifetime. And so that's no different with gene therapies. What's difficult is that we're trying to get things through really quickly because it's so important and there's an unmet need. We sometimes measure the wrong things, or we don't measure them for long enough. So we're not really sure what that longer term impact is, which makes decisions really difficult, makes for a lot of uncertainty. We're sometimes not measuring what's really important to patients because we're relying on a surrogate marker. And maybe the work's not been done to show the correlation relationship between those. So I think there's a lot of value in any treatment where there's an unmet need. And if you're delivering a big clinical benefit, you're going to have a lot of value in that product, in that treatment. And the gene therapy part can sometimes be a distraction from what's actually questions being asked about any treatment. And I'll leave others to disagree or to build on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Josie. Anyone else want to come in on this?
I think, just to probably expand a little bit on what Josie was saying, I agree, like when it comes to reimbursement, I think it's not that it's a gene therapy, like just the biggest challenge is that really that long-term durability of the treatment. Like you can't expect the UK to pay millions of pounds when the manufacturer says, we don't really know how long it's going to, we don't have the data yet. It's not our fault. We just don't have the data to know how many years. So how do you reach an agreement on what's fair to pay? It's really, really difficult. If we're looking at paying in the same way we do based on the value of the treatment. And that's where, the whole complication about can we consider different payment models where can you pay in installments based on how long the treatment is effective for? So, if the treatment's still effective after 3 years, then the UK would pay some more money to the manufacturer. That's a whole issue that is very complicated, and within a big infrastructure like we have in the UK with the NHS and the government, implementing that new kind of model would be it's difficult, and you'd have to have an outcome that you can easily measure, and that is it going to create burden for patients? It's very difficult, and there are many of the discussions that are ongoing at the moment. And there are those type of contracts that exist in the US a lot more with the private health insurance system they have, but they still come with a lot of challenges there as well. And I think yeah, that's the biggest thing when it comes to gene therapies and reimbursement. That's, as Joe said, creating that uncertainty. That's probably one of the biggest barriers there, that we need to figure out how to manage as more of these therapies are going to come to market or want to be reimbursed in the coming years. But it's difficult, and everyone's got their own constraints they're working under, but everyone wants to get them through. We just need to get people around the table and figure it out, but it's not an easy one.
Thank you, Kate. That's a nice kind of building there, and definitely something I was trying to angle to get discussed in there. So thank you both for contributing to that. Anything to add, guys, or shall I just kind of move us? We're getting towards the end now, so I've got a couple of things I want to touch on, but all good. Cool. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. So obviously we've tried to, in this discussion, work a lot through some topics around patient engagement and the roles we're playing there. That is directly in response to a number of questions that you guys did share with us in advance. So I hope those of you that submitted questions do feel that we've tried to address those, if not directly, then indirectly, with respect to that. We're kind of coming towards the last 10 minutes or so of the session. I think I'll just touch on one more of the specific questions that was brought through, and then we're going to have a closing question to sum up. So I think it'd just be worth us collectively thinking now about one question that was submitted was, how can we encourage development in disease areas without any current regulatory precedent? So essentially, what can we do to drive forward development of some of these advanced therapies where there's just no treatment whatsoever? Is there anything specific or unique about those areas, or anything we can do from the research side, the regulatory side, to try and encourage people to look at some of the rarest diseases that we're talking about here? And do we see any real roadblocks to that moving forward? Don't know, Simon, if you've got any thoughts on that as the person at the start of the process, at least.
I mean, my experience is that the reason for us starting to do research on a particular disease is particularly if a clinician has contacted us, said there's this disease where all we can do is symptomatic management, poor symptomatic management. Do you think we can do gene therapy for this? So it means that the clinician sees the patients, realizes there's a major unmet need, and also recognizes there is a potential of this technology. Now certainly there are more and more clinicians now hearing about gene therapy and going, oh, okay, kind of, let's try this. But that's been a major driver. There are sometimes instances where there are patient groups which have come to me or my colleagues and said, do you think this is something that we can do for gene therapy? But then what you end up doing is you end up having to look around to see where you can get clinicians who know the condition and will be enthusiastic. Because if we can't bridge that bit, then we can do all the research we want, but it's not going to go anywhere at the end. So really, actually, a big part of it is actually having clinicians that get it and see the patients.
That's a great answer, Sam. Thank you. And it feeds into a lot of stuff we talk about often in this space around, the business speak is breaking down silos, right? Finding ways to break down the different pockets of knowledge that sit in different spaces and ensuring they're talking to each other. And if you've got academic scientists speaking to clinicians, speaking to patients, and speaking to regulators, then we're beginning to get a pathway joined up that gives us a real chance to develop a treatment in a space that doesn't exist. So I think that's really helpful. Josie?
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Simon. It's a great way of looking at it. And for patient organisations, I think it's really clear they need to know the disease, and that might mean funding really early research into animal models, trying to actually understand what's the mechanisms of these diseases, getting researchers excited. Pay for a PhD student, that tends to get quite a lot of progress and people interested, I find. But really knowing the disease, the condition, and then knowing the patients as well. And actually, as patient communities, you often are sitting on a huge amount of knowledge of both of those things, not quite the same, and are able to bring that. Most rare disease patient organizations work really closely, I think, with the clinical community. But if you're starting out, you might not have built those relationships yet. And they're so important to be able to have that scientific and clinical input into the discussions and the work that you're doing. And you're basically building yourself an advocate for later on down the system. So if that's the point that you're at, where there's really not much research happening in your condition, looking at how far back the stream you have, how far upstream you have to go before you're finding something you can build on, It might be really basic research that we do see a lot of patient organisations funding these days, and then finding some clinicians who may not yet be excited, but could be made to be excited. You know, that actually there's a lot of people there, maybe earlier in their career. It might not be the leading experts right now, but there might be someone who's interested and open to learning about this condition and to being an advocate going forward.
Thanks, Josie. That definitely speaks into what the kind of next kind of final question is, which is what do we think as a panel that the people attending the webinar now, people who are representing patient organisations and leading those groups, what is it that they can do to try and, as a next step, be more prepared or move forward into this space of advanced therapies? What should they do after listening to this webinar series to try and move things forward? So, Jeff, maybe I'll come to you on this. And what do you think are the key things as a patient to try and tackle in this?
Well, actually, I mean, Josie said a lot of the things I was about to say. I think it's, understanding your condition really well, the history of it, how it works, and then more just kind of build on something. I think building a database, basically, if the patient group can be the first group to start to understand, how many people have this condition, where are they in the country, what is happening, how are they living their lives at the moment, then that puts you in a good position to puts you in a far better position to kind of advocate for that. And then maybe it's the only thing I was going to add, because we were talking a bit earlier about engaging. I think getting yourself and identifying the right people. And so yes, people in the patient group will tend to be in contact with the clinicians that are treating people with the condition. But if you want to get early in that process, you need to get yourself to the academic and scientific conferences, listen and see who's doing that early work or doing it, work in an adjacent area, and just sometimes you just need to network your way in to find out what's going on. So yeah, I would encourage more patient groups and patient advocates to get out and about to conferences to just build those connections.
Thanks, Jeff. That's great advice. Kate, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess thinking about maybe ultra rare diseases or disease areas where there isn't like a big established patient group already, I think setting that up is really hard, right? And you've just got to start small, like get a presence, have a Facebook page, obviously even a website's a big deal. It takes time and resources. So even just having that bit of a platform that if a pharma company or someone is looking, they can find you, and then that's a source of patient experts already. And again, for engaging with the clinicians, if there's a group that they can connect with, it builds a presence, it builds a profile, and I think that's always a great starting entry in where that big established patient group doesn't yet exist. And then hopefully you can be found, as well as finding people and reaching out as a little like team or organization.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to you all. I'm noting the time, and I think Hannah has a few things we need to say to wrap up, so I will quickly take the opportunity to thank all of the panel. I've had a great time. I've really had good conversation, I think great discussion, and appreciate all the contributions from each of you, as well as from the audience. So thank you for that. I hope this has been an interesting, engaging webinar for you guys listening, and I'll pass over to Hannah now to wrap things up. Hannah, thank you.
Hi everyone, and again, I just want to echo what Rick said, and a massive thank you for everyone for tuning in, and also for our panelists. I thought it was really interesting. I've definitely learned loads throughout this webinar series, and it was just really great. And if you have missed any of the previous webinars, because we reference them a lot, but there's like a lot to learn, they will be on our resources hub, and I'll link that to you in the follow-up email. And also, I just encourage everyone to please complete our feedback survey, which I'm just putting in the chat now. It's really important for us to gather your feedback, and we can use that for our impact. And just thanks again, everyone, for coming. And thanks to the panelists for a great session, and hope to see you at the next Beacon event.